Hello, and welcome back to our study in Paul's epistle to the church at Rome, which I've subtitled Rediscovering the Gospel of Salvation. And as Paul is laying out his gospel, he's doing it admittedly slowly, methodically, systematically. But where he is building is laying this incredible foundation to be able to just unfold the gospel. And so he starts out with a very, quite frankly, depressing analysis of the heart of man and his inability, despite overwhelming evidence that God provides, in order to respond to God in the correct way. And so, as we pick this up in Romans chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 9. And let me just throw out something. As Paul is building this, as we've termed, a legal case, just laying evidence upon evidence upon evidence, I would suggest that if I were doing it in 1640 and putting the chapter numbers and verses in place, I would move Romans chapter 3 to verse 9. And I'd use verse 9. It's Romans 3:1, because really Paul is just laying out evidence after evidence from Romans 1:18, where he says the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's where he starts. And he builds this case that even though God has provided everything to be able to respond to him correctly, first in creation, then in conscience, so that they were out without excuse. And then he moves on to Israel, that God just opens the floodgates of revelation in the law and the prophets and instruction and in miracles and provision and in just grace and mercy and love that is expended toward Israel. And so Paul has laid out all of this evidence, and Romans 3:9 begins with the conclusion. All right, what do we learn from this class of all this that Paul is laying out? And here's what he says. What then? Are we, meaning Israel, better than they? Not at all, for we've already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. So the conclusion is that no matter how much evidence, no matter how much revelation God provides to natural man, his response is always going to be the same: to turn away, to reject the truth to which he has been given, and to go his own way, to act in disobedience and rebellion. So basically, what he's saying is Israel winds up in the same place as the people in Noah's day at the flood or at Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no difference. And so what's God doing here then is the question. But Paul says, okay, let me, in case you haven't gotten it, in case you've it hasn't been exactly clear, let me lay out exactly where the heart of man is. And this is difficult for us, because as we brought up Isaiah 55 the last time, where it says, my thoughts are above your thoughts and my ways are above your ways. And as far as the heavens are from the earth, so are my thoughts and my ways above your ways. Because when we approach God and we see Israel, we say, well, naturally, God is giving them instructions, and the expectation is that it will produce righteousness and they will be pleasing to God. And God will say, well done, good and faithful Israel servants, and enter into the joy of your master. But in the last episode, we saw that that wasn't the intent of God at all. As a matter of fact, the intent of giving Israel all of these things, as well as all of man with creation and conscience, was never to bring him to faith, but it was just to show and demonstrate how righteous God is in his judgment of evil and rebellious men. And that's quite a mind-blowing concept to us, because it is the opposite of what we would automatically assume, or what we would automatically think God would be doing in the actions that he unfolds. And so here's the conclusion that Paul makes regarding the first 2.5 chapters of Romans. He says, There is none righteous, not even one. Righteousness was the goal and is the goal. And after all of this revelation, how many people achieve the goal? Zero. There's none righteous. And then Paul emphasizes it. Just in case you were thinking this is not specifically saying all, he says, not even one. Well, what about Noah and Abraham? Were they not righteous? And the point is that man on his own, with his natural abilities and resources and thinking, will never achieve righteousness. Something else, the Spirit of the living God, must intervene if this is to actually become a reality, right? There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. Well, I was seeking God in Buddhism and Hinduism, and finally I found Jesus. No, you weren't. You were going the opposite direction when you were going after all these other gods, as in the same way that Israel, taking the legitimate divine revelation of God, and they implemented it in such a way that it caused them to oppose God to the point where they executed the Son of God, right? All have turned aside. Not most, not all except a few. All have turned aside and become useless. There is none who does good. Well, not even one. So Paul is saying this again and again and again because he knows that there's going to be pushback, that there's going to be natural rejection of these concepts. As what do you mean there's not one person who seeks for God, Paul? There's not one person who God accepts as righteous. There's not one person who realizes, looks at the evidence and realizes his need for mercy before a holy God. No, not even one is what Paul is saying. And then he goes on to describe who we are. Their throat is an open grave. Not only do they not do good, but evil is, as Genesis 5:6 says, their every intention of the heart of man is only evil continually. And here's how it manifests itself. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, and destruction and misery are in their path, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And he's all quoting from the Old Testament. So he's not introducing this new revolutionary concept here. He's just saying, this is what the purpose was, and this is who God knew who man was all along. And what I am doing is just putting it in a systematic format so you could understand the plight of man, the distress, the absolute futility of man in trying through his own efforts to please God. So we say, well, what about the law, Paul? I mean, God gave Moses, and he came down from the mountain, and he consecrated the people with the blood, with the hyssop, and the whole thing, and all this was just for naught? Well, it wasn't for naught. One, as we said last time, it was to demonstrate unequivocally God's righteousness and justice in his judgment and condemnation of all of mankind. And two, the other thing is that the law was given not to produce righteousness, but to show our utter inability in our failure in any effort that we do in order to produce righteousness. And he explains that in verse 19. Now, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God. So again, this is the purpose of the law, is not to liberate people, but it's to hold them accountable to God. As a matter of fact, as we look at the law and what it is for, we thought, or we were told in Sunday school, that the old covenant was a works covenant and the new covenant is a covenant of grace. So after all these this effort that we put in, God finally says, forget it. Don't worry about it. I'll just take care of it for you, right? Well, no, because the covenant of grace is a, I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but it is a works covenant. It's works of an obedient faith, an abiding faith. So, from that standpoint, there are works in the grace, the covenant of grace, but it's the works which proceed from a new creation. So, when Paul says in Romans chapter 3, there is none righteous, not even one, evangelicalism, Protestantism, the reformers, made this huge mistake by thinking that this applies to the new creation as well. What Paul is doing here is he's condemning natural man, but he's not applying there are none righteous, there is none who seek for God. Most of the people I would assume that are listening to this YouTube channel are truly seeking for God. Otherwise, you wouldn't have put up with me this long, right? In my heart of hearts, I am truly seeking for the truth and for God. So there's a difference between what Paul is describing here in Romans chapter 3, as there's none righteous, there's none good, there's none who seek for God. That is prior. That is in all of man's natural efforts. This is the result. But once we have been enlightened, once we have been made new, once we are given a new spirit and the spirit of the living God, we're no longer unrighteous. We now have the ability and the motivation to seek for God and to pursue him and to fulfill the command that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, right? And that's what a few of us are truly endeavoring to do. And we don't do it perfectly, and we fall and we slip and we get distracted. But overall, the curve, as you chart the X and the Y axis, is up and to the right throughout our lives. And that's what Paul is saying here. And then in verse 20, he says, because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. And then he tells us why God gave the law. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Sin becomes utterly sinful. The law magnifies sin. It shines the light on our utter inability to do what is required in order to stand before a holy God, right? And so as we look at these things, God introduces now a new covenant, as Jeremiah 31:31 says, where I will give you a new covenant, and I'll write my laws on your heart, not like the old covenant which I made with their fathers in the day, which I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. So they broke it. They were unable to fulfill it. Why were they unable to fulfill it? Because they didn't have the resources in order to satisfy the requirements of the law. And Romans 8, little spoiler alert, I guess, but Romans 8:3 tells us this. For what the law could not do. Why, Paul? Why could the law not produce righteousness? Weak as it was through the flesh, because the resource that was available to natural man in order to use the law as the tool to produce righteousness was wholly inadequate and incapable of using that tool in the way that it could accomplish what was desired, right? So, what is this law? Why was it given to us? Well, I guess what I always considered a pretty good illustration, and I've been teaching this for a long time, is the law is like a plumb line. So if I'm a mason and I'm building a wall, I hang a string with a weight on the bottom of it, and it hangs perpendicular to the earth, right? And it's a straight up and down 90-degree line. And as I build my wall and I hang that plumb line next to the wall, I can tell to what degree my wall is not straight or how crooked it is. And some walls are more crooked than others, some walls are almost straight, but according to the law, no wall is perfectly straight. And so, what the law does, what a plumb line does, is it tells me or indicates to me how crooked or how off from straight the wall of righteousness that I'm trying to build is built. But the law, like a plumb line, can do nothing to straighten the wall or correct my unrighteousness. All it can do is it's a gauge, it's a meter to tell me how far off I am. But that meter cannot be used in any way to straighten it or correct it or bring it into line with where it should be. And so that is the purpose of the law. And again, let me just reiterate, because I'm going to go over this a lot, and just to plant this in your mind, that righteousness is the goal, that becoming righteous is the goal. It's not just having our sins forgiven. Yes, that's wholly important and amazing, and the cross and everything else, but there's an expectation after our sins have been forgiven, and we're going to get into that big time next and the next YouTube series, of that we will actually produce something, produce righteousness. And this is what is lost in the evangelical church for salvation, at least. And I'm going to, again, do a little spoiler jumping ahead, but I think it really fits in with this. In Romans 9, it says, "What shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were by works." And these are works of the law or works of the flesh, right? And we have to differentiate between the works of the law and the works of the flesh, and the works which God does through us through an abiding and obedient faith walk. So therefore, the law is referred to not as a ministry of life or a path to righteousness, but Second Corinthians refers to it as a ministry of death or a ministry of condemnation. And Colossians refers to it is that what it describes the law as is a law. The law is a certificate of death. It's a death certificate consisting of degrees against us, which was hostile to us. And so I'm going to kind of leave it right there. And hopefully this is starting to gel and to make sense, and it's starting to fit into this model, which fits together like a well-oiled Swiss watch and just runs and propels. And now we are going to finally get into the but now. We're done with the condemnation of natural man, and God is going to begin to reveal the good news of the gospel. So, for those of you who have been patiently waiting for that, it's coming next time. So, again, thank you so much for your continued support, your prayers. Just give us a like, a subscribe if you would. Help us to get this gospel out. Leave a comment. I'd love to interact with you folks. And thank you so much for those of you who are praying for me as I continue to pray for the listeners of this channel. So God bless you all.